Hello, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen back with my Week 8 comment response video. In this video, I wanted to provide some additional context and information about one of the things we discussed last week during our conversations on sexology. If you'll recall, in one of my follow-up questions, I asked about women's contributions to sexological knowledge. Did female sexologists have a more enlightened, progressive view of sexuality than their male counterparts? Were they more tolerant and accepting of things like sexual inversion than their male peers? Did they put forth alternative understandings of homosexuality, and what might these have been? As a means of addressing these questions, I shared with you all a piece by Frances Worsley Stella Brown, who lived from 1880 to 1955, and who was a Canadian socialist feminist who spent much of her life campaigning for women's rights, especially within the birth control and abortion law reform movements. Those who commented on her writings correctly pointed out that, unlike many male sexologists, Brown was a friend of feminism, and that in addition to seeing female homosexuality as normal and natural, she took an intersectional approach to her work, refusing to see all women as one category. As she put it in a letter from 1937, "I know it is a dreadful confession, but I have never met the normal woman. I have seen a lot about her in print and heard a lot, but I have never met her." In this video, I'm not going to say more about Stella Brown because I want to turn our attention to some other female sexologists of note. However, if you're interested in learning more about Brown, I heartily recommend Leslie Hall's excellent article on her, which you can find here. In this video, I'm going to talk about Germany, which, as the birthplace of sexology, was home to a number of activist women who contributed to this emerging discipline. Examples of this include Johanna Elberskirchen, Mathilde Werting, Sophie Lazarsfeld, Helene Stöcker, Ruth Bray, and Anna Röhling. Most of these women hailed from middle-class backgrounds and benefited from the urbanization and industrialization of early 20th century Germany, which enabled middle-class women to make inroads into the public sphere, especially in the worlds of work and education. From this emerged a movement for women's rights, and in addition to agitating for the right to vote, German feminists became involved in discussions around a great variety of controversial topics, including prostitution, single motherhood, marriage, sexual education, female sexual desire, and homosexuality. Women's sexological work often emerged out of these movements, and it was frequently published, either in leading sexological journals or as monographs and pamphlets. For a sampling of some of this female-authored sexological scholarship, see the following bibliography. Despite this evidence of women's sexological writing, I should point out here that it was quite difficult for women to publish anything on this topic. For one, female sexologists were incredibly marginalized within the field. On account of sexism and other social inequalities, few women in early 20th century Germany had the opportunity to earn a university degree and acquire a professional title. Because of this, female sexologists generally lacked access to the kinds of clinical facilities that served as the point of departure for most male sexological research. In addition to this, female sexologists had to contend with outright misogyny from their male counterparts, many of whom dismissed their work as overly emotional, as subjective, and as amateurish. Male sexologists often insisted that their female colleagues lacked the ability to carry out quote-unquote objective research and to analyze their data in a rational manner. Given this, the question arises, how did female sexologists break into this male-dominated field? And did their experiences of gendered hostility give them a different understanding of sexuality? With regard to the first of these questions, it seems that female sexologists were able to break into the field by playing up their differences as women and arguing that this status gave them the ability to study female sexuality in a more objective way. Here, their basic claim was that when men wrote about women, they did so in a subjective, biased manner, as their a priori beliefs about women's inferiority prevented them from seeing things in a true light. In other words, their scientific methodology had been distorted by sexism. Women were thus more objective when it came to women. Social inequalities between men and women, they argued, had influenced the production of sexological knowledge, leading to a number of erroneous ideas. Thus, male-authored statements could not be taken as factual. As Sophie Lazarsfeld put it in her 1931 book, Woman's Experience of the Male, quote, "Those sex books which are based on practical experience have been written by men for men, and from the masculine point of view. They bear the clear impress of the man-managed civilization in which women play a secondary role, and accordingly are treated with a certain condescension." So here, the argument was that women were better positioned to study female sexuality because their ideas and methods had not been damaged by sexist stereotypes, namely the assumption that women were innately inferior. So, what about the second question? Did women's unique social position, and especially their experiences of marginalization and discrimination, give them a different understanding of sexuality? As we've already seen from the writings of Stella Brown, there are good grounds for thinking that female sexologists were more progressive, more enlightened, and more liberationist in their views compared to male sexologists. Much more so than the likes of Magnus Hirschfeld and Richard von Krafft-Ebing, they championed the rights of minorities and actively advocated for expanded rights and freedoms. Indeed, whereas male sexologists often sought to preserve the social status quo, female sexologists were committed to changing the country's political, social, and economic order. They wanted to revolutionize attitudes toward female sexuality in particular. In contrast to the prevailing construction of the ideal woman as an asexual, passionless being who desired only motherhood, female sexologists asserted that women had innate sexual needs and desires, and that their sexual impulses were entirely healthy. So, does this mean that female sexological writing was less, dare I say, biased than that of their male peers? Was it, for example, less racist, less sexist, less classist? And if so, does that mean that female sexologists got closer to the truth of sexuality? In formulating their own theories, female sexologists drew upon their experiences as women and their more intimate knowledge of women generally. In the process, they produced some new insights, some of which were at odds with the ideas of their male peers. As an example of this, consider Johanna Elberskirchen's alternative understanding of female homosexuality. In her writings, which included The Love of the Third Sex and Revolution and the Emancipation of Women, both from 1904, Elberskirchen, who, I should note, lived openly as a lesbian, criticized the idea of sexual inversion. Male theorists, if you'll recall, argued that women's same-sex desire originated from a misalignment between their biological sex and their social gender. That is to say, lesbians were really men who were stuck in women's bodies. Repudiating this theory, Elberskirchen contended that neither woman in a same-sex couple was actually compelled by or interested in masculinity. As she put it, both love in the other the same sex, the feminine, not the masculine. Thus, as she had it, Instead of being masculine, homosexual women were actually the most feminine of women, given their total rejection of men and masculinity. This was quite a different understanding of things. Totally accepting of these relations, Elberskirchen also wrote that, quote, homosexuality and the love of homosexuality is no degeneration, is no psychopathy, and it is not a source of guilt or shame. This was arguably a much more tolerant, much more empowering view of female homosexuality than any of her male colleagues put forward. In her work, we see none of the blatant heterosexism seen in the writings of many male sexologists. But this is not to say that female sexologists got closer to the truth of sexuality. Just like their male colleagues, these writers had their own biases. For one, their work was thoroughly Eurocentric, and it reflected middle-class assumptions about the world. There were other limits here as well. Despite the empowering, emancipatory language, one often sees some rather exclusionary and restrictive language as well. As critical of existing social injustices as they were, female sexologists also reproduced and championed a number of these injustices. More than anything else, they contributed to the emerging idea that sexual freedom and rights were contingent on health and morality. Instead of arguing that all women had an inherent right to sexual self-determination, they advocated only for the empowerment of those women deemed healthy. Unhealthy women, they contended, did not have a right to sexual fulfillment. By unhealthy, they meant those suffering from physical and mental impairments, those suffering from various illnesses, and groups like alcoholics, the quote-unquote crippled, and the quote-unquote feeble-minded. In other words, disease and disability marked the boundaries of sexual agency. Here, health was the determining factor for sexual freedoms, and in this sense, we could say that women's sexological writings, just like men's, were ableist. What gave women the right to sexual freedom, they argued, was their fitness. Those deemed unfit were not to be given these freedoms. We can see these ideas appearing quite frequently in the writings of German female sexologists. For example, in one of her books, Helene Stucke wrote that, quote, a life in which sexual fulfillment is denied is incompatible with fine creative work, at any rate, in a healthy woman in whom the instinctive life is normally developed. Echoing this, in her book The Right to Motherhood, Ruth Bray declared that her intention was to, quote, speak for women who are really women, with healthy bodies and healthy desires. There were eugenic undertones in many of these writings. One sees this even in texts that proclaim the rights of homosexuals. For example, in her 1904 speech, What Interest Does the Woman's Movement Have in the Homosexual Problem?, Anna Röhling declared that female inverts ought to be exempt from marriage and motherhood. Arguing that lesbians were either averse or indifferent to marital duties, she insisted that, quote, the marriage of homosexuals is a triple crime. It is a crime against the state, against society itself, and against an unborn generation, for experience teaches us that the offspring of Uranians are seldom healthy and strong. When homosexuals had children, she asserted, they were often mentally disturbed, tubercular, and, as she put it, quote, degenerates of all kind. Writings such as these provide us with important insights into the relationship between sexuality and disability. In the emphasis they placed on health and beauty as criteria for sexual freedom, German female sexologists contributed to the emergence of the idea that able-bodiedness is a prerequisite for sexual rights. This is part of the process by which sexual desirability has been tied to fitness, and by which disability has been tied to pathological sexuality. This was a feature of the eugenics movement, and it certainly was something that female sexologists contributed to just as much as their male colleagues did. So clearly, female sexologists were unable to escape all of the prejudicial views of their profession. Often they perpetuated these, internalizing sexology's ideologies, and they were unable to produce sexual knowledge that was more correct or more authentic than that produced by men. And that is where we'll have to leave it for now. Thanks so much for watching. If you've got questions about the content in this video, please feel free to ask them. Until next time, this is Professor Bowen signing off. Stay safe, everyone. Later.